A nation upended. The coup of February 1st, 2021. This event would forever alter the course of Myanmar's history, leaving an indelible mark on its people and its future. Myanmar, a nation on the brink of democratic transition, was thrust back into darkness on February 1st, 2021. The country had been making strides towards democracy, with hopes high among its citizens for a brighter, more inclusive future. The military, known as the Tatmadaw, staged a coup d'etat, seizing control of the government and detaining democratically elected leaders. This sudden and forceful takeover shocked the nation and the world, as the Tatmadaw justified their actions by alleging widespread electoral fraud in the recent elections. Aung San Suu Kyi, the nation's de facto leader and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, was placed under house arrest, along with other high-ranking officials from the National League for Democracy party. Suu Kyi, a symbol of hope and resilience for many, had long been a thorn in the side of the military establishment. The coup sent shockwaves through Myanmar and the international community. Governments and organizations around the world quickly condemned the military's actions, calling for the restoration of democracy and the release of detained leaders. It marked a stark reversal of the fragile progress made towards democracy after decades of military rule. The people of Myanmar had participated in elections with the hope of shaping their own destiny, only to see their efforts undone in an instant. The Tatmadaw's actions drew widespread condemnation, with many world leaders calling for the immediate release of detained officials and a return to democratic rule. International protests erupted, with people around the globe standing in solidarity with the citizens of Myanmar. The coup triggered widespread protests across the country. From the bustling streets of Yangon to the remote villages, citizens united in their demand for justice and democracy. Citizens from all walks of life took to the streets, demanding a restoration of democracy and the release of their elected leaders. The protests were a testament to the resilience and determination of the Myanmar people, who refused to be silenced. These protests were met with a brutal crackdown by the military, who responded with deadly force, using live ammunition, tear gas and water cannons against peaceful demonstrators. The violence resulted in numerous casualties, further fueling the anger and resolve of the protesters. The February 2021 coup plunged Myanmar into a state of crisis, with far-reaching consequences for its people, its economy, and its future. The instability disrupted daily life, with businesses closing, supply chains breaking down, and the economy teetering on the brink of collapse. The events of that day marked a turning point in the country's history, setting in motion a chain of events that continue to unfold to this day. The struggle for democracy in Myanmar is far from over, and the resilience of its people remains a beacon of hope in these challenging times. The rise of resistance, the NUG, and a fractured political landscape. In the wake of the coup, a shadow government emerged known as the National Unity Government, or NUG. This entity was formed as a direct response to the military's seizure of power, aiming to restore democracy and represent the will of the people. The new G, composed of ousted lawmakers from the NLD and representatives from ethnic minority groups, declared itself the legitimate government of Myanmar. This coalition was not just a symbolic gesture, it was a strategic move to unify the diverse opposition forces against the military junta. The NUEG sought to unite the various opposition forces in the country, including the People's Defence Forces civilian militias that had sprung up across the country to resist the junta. These militias, often formed by ordinary citizens, were determined to protect their communities and fight for a democratic future. The emergence of the NUEG signified a significant development in Myanmar's political landscape. It provided a beacon of hope for many who had lost faith in the possibility of democratic governance. It represented a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the military junta and provided a focal point for resistance. The NUG's existence was a testament to the resilience and determination of the Myanmar people. The NUG garnered support from various ethnic armed groups who had long been engaged in armed struggle against the Tatmadaw, further complicating the political landscape. These groups saw an opportunity to align with a broader movement that shared their goal of ending military rule. The Tatmadaw, for its part, sought to consolidate its grip on power through a campaign of intimidation and violence. The military's actions were aimed at crushing any form of dissent and maintaining control over the country. The junta imposed martial law, restricted freedom of movement and assembly, and launched a brutal crackdown on dissent. These measures were designed to instill fear and suppress any opposition to their rule. Journalists, activists, and anyone suspected of opposing the military regime were subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, torture, and enforced disappearances. The crackdown on the press and civil society was particularly severe, as the junta sought to control the narrative and silence any voices of dissent. The political landscape in Myanmar, once characterized by a fragile transition towards democracy, became increasingly fragmented and volatile. The coup shattered the hopes of many who had believed in a peaceful and democratic future for the country. The coup and the subsequent emergence of the NUG and the PDFs led to a complex and multifaceted conflict, with no easy solutions in sight. The situation in Myanmar remains dire, with ongoing violence and a deeply divided society. The international community continues to watch closely, hoping for a resolution that will bring peace and stability to the region. Descent into chaos, armed conflict, and the human cost. The once peaceful landscapes of Myanmar have been transformed into scenes of devastation and despair. The coup triggered a rapid escalation of armed conflict across Myanmar. What began as a political upheaval quickly spiraled into widespread violence, engulfing the nation in turmoil. The Tatmadaw, facing resistance from both the PDFs and established ethnic armed groups, launched a series of offensives, particularly in ethnic minority regions. These regions, already marginalized, bore the brunt of the military's wrath. These offensives, characterized by indiscriminate airstrikes, artillery bombardments, and ground assaults, resulted in widespread displacement, death and destruction. Entire communities were uprooted, and the scars of war became etched into the land. The PDFs, often outgunned and outmatched by the Tatmadaw, engaged in guerrilla warfare tactics, ambushing military convoys and targeting junta-affiliated businesses and individuals. Their resilience, though commendable, came at a high cost. While the PDF's resistance slowed the junta's advance in some areas, it also resulted in brutal reprisals against civilians suspected of supporting the resistance. Innocent lives were caught in the crossfire, and the cycle of violence seemed unending. The escalation of armed conflict had a devastating impact on civilians. Families were torn apart, and the social fabric of communities was irreparably damaged. Villages were razed, homes looted and destroyed, and livelihoods shattered. The destruction was not just physical, but also emotional, leaving deep psychological scars on the survivors. Thousands of civilians were killed, including women, children, and the elderly. The loss of life was staggering, and the grief of those left behind was immeasurable. Millions were displaced, forced to flee their homes in search of safety and refuge in neighboring countries or within Myanmar's borders. The journey to safety was fraught with danger, and many faced insurmountable challenges along the way. The conflict in Myanmar transformed from a political crisis into a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe. The scale of suffering was immense, and the need for aid and support grew exponentially. The United Nations estimated that by 2023, over 1.5 million people had been internally displaced, with millions more in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. The international community's response was crucial, but the challenges remained daunting. Voices from the abyss chronicling human rights abuses. As the conflict raged on, reports of widespread and systematic human rights abuses committed by the Tatmadaw continued to emerge. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, documented extrajudicial killings, torture, sexual violence, arbitrary arrests, and enforced disappearances. The Tatmadaws' tactics were often characterized by a complete disregard for human life and a deliberate targeting of civilians. Villages were burned, civilians used as human shields, and medical workers attacked. The junta imposed severe restrictions on freedom of expression, shutting down independent media outlets and arresting journalists and activists. The International Criminal Court opened an investigation into alleged crimes committed in Myanmar, including the deportation of Rohingya Muslims to Bangladesh in 2017. The United Nations Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar continued to gather evidence of international crimes, including genocide and crimes against humanity. The human rights situation in Myanmar remained dire. The international community faced a moral imperative to hold the perpetrators of these atrocities accountable and to provide justice for the victims of the junta's brutality.